Okay, so let's have a little look at the federation. Lots of people were now leaving Europe to get abroad, and they went to places like South Africa, Canada, United States, and of course the Rhodesians, and my parents were amongst them. And it was a very peaceful time. There was no fighting going on, and they were actually achieving an awful lot of things. Now, in the peaceful times, these sorts of things can only happen if there's no fighting. So, for example, we had Alfred Hitchcock came here to make a film in 1954. Unfortunately, it was never finished because his leading lady left to go and get married to Prince Rainier of Monaco. And they've just made a film about it. We had people like Danny Kaye coming through on his holidays. We had big sporting tours by the All Blacks, the Australians, and the British Lions at Rugby. The first ever officer cadet to win the Sword of Honor at Sandhurst from a Commonwealth nation came from Zambia. His name was Jack Crutchley. And he was later based with the Rhodesian Special Air Service at Ndola on the Copperbelt. And his best friend from the same town, who went to the same school and still writes today, is Wilbur Smith. We had Stanley Matthews and Tom Finney to come and teach the local sides to play football. And of course, it came back to pay off rather nicely later on, which I'll come back to. We had people like the great Satchmo, Louis Armstrong coming through on tour, and the Harlem Globetrotters, all before independence. And here's a surprise for you. Northern Rhodesia has only ever played the Australians once at cricket. It's a two-day game, and we drew. So we are the only country in the world remained unbeaten by Australia at cricket, which is rather cool. Richie Beno took 10 wickets in the game, and it was all played up in Kitwe. It was a huge area up there for sports, which was wonderful. In 1960, the Queen Mother came through to officially open Lake Kariba, which was the biggest man-made lake at the time. And remember, it was only 2 years after everything had been ripped out by that huge flood of 1958. So despite all the problems, they managed to complete the project. She then went on a world tour of Barotseland just to keep the relationships up with the guy who invited us here all those many years ago, the Litunga of Barotseland. We continue to develop at sport and produce the world's youngest ever international rugby player, a guy called Steve O'Neill, in 1950, at the age of 17. And it's not some New Zealander or anybody else like that. It's actually a Northern Rhodesian who was the youngest ever international rugby player. He also had the honor of earning a black belt in judo, and went on to become the second and only other person to have completed the 100-man kumite, which is it took him 2 hours and 45 minutes to compete in. Yeah, a hell of a guy at that. The first African to win a blue at either Oxford or Cambridge was a man called David Pirrie in 1963 at golf. And a young runner called Yotam Malaya soundly beat the British cross-country champion in the late 1950s, but unfortunately he lost his life in a car crash in the USA as he was about to begin his career. And whilst other countries did have a war of liberation, Zambia did not. Our independence came in on the 24th of October 1964, when Princess Mary represented the Queen at Zambia's independence celebrations. But the extraordinary thing here is it's back to sport, because we became the only country in the world to change our name during an Olympic Games. We marched on at Tokyo 1964 as Northern Rhodesia, and we marched off as Zambia. And they still mention it from time to time.
You know, I just want to, I want to just nut in there.
Okay.
Just talking about the 49 All Blacks, Andy McDonald.
Yes, indeed.
Tell us a bit about him. He was in the front row. There's a bit of a squabble between us south of the Zambezi and you guys north about who he belongs to, but an interesting guy, and he just survived a lion attack, I think. Or that came.
He had. Yeah, he was farming just outside Livingston, strangely enough, and as the story goes, he went out to go and look after his cattle, and a lion came to attack him. So he did shoot it, And then he couldn't get the second round into his weapon, and it attacked him. And he held the weapon over his head or in front of him, and it bit on it and chewed its way along. He certainly lost a finger, but he ended up in hospital and had like 400 stitches put in by his brother-in-law, Dr. de Kock. But the lion walked off and died of exhaustion after fighting Andy. And by all accounts, Andy got hold of its tongue and pulled it out of its head at some point. But the New Zealanders recognize him as being the strongest rugby player they ever had, they ever played against. And it's not surprising. He was a massive guy, but a gentle giant, and sadly lost his life later on. Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, Peter, it was quite. I used to sit on the sidelines listening to the arguments, just checking this in between Ronry Daly and Ian Smith, because they were both rugby mad. And Ian Smith, in his mind, that victory over the All Blacks was all about Rhodesia. And it was actually Ronry Daly who used to have to say, no, sir, it wasn't. It was those chaps across the river. They had a lot, they had a lot to do with it. Old Ian Smith didn't particularly want to hear that.
No, that's right. And I think there were 5 players from Northern Rhodesia who played. And in fact, there's 2 interesting things here. The first one is that the famous green and white jersey is not Southern Rhodesia's, it's ours. And I mean the 2 Rhodesias. When Northern Rhodesia played against Southern Rhodesia, the Southerners played in a plain green jersey with a white collar, and we in the North played in royal blue with a white stripe and a gold stripe. When we played together, it was the green and white striped jersey. But of course, when independence came, there were no more internal games between us to play, and so they only played international matches.
Okay.
But the other thing about it is that when we played against each other for the Clark Cup, the Northerners beat the Southerners more times than the other way around. And that's because we could pay the South African rugby team so much more money up on the copper belt.
That we could pay them on the tobacco farm.
We won more. Yeah, and there's some great players who the Southerners like to think started with them, and they didn't. I think the famous Van Jaarsveld actually started in Northern Rhodesia, for example, along with the hooker whose name I forget momentarily. But the other strange thing that comes out with rugby is that the Argentinians call themselves the Pumas, and that came after the game in '65 when a journalist mistook the jaguar on their emblem for a puma, and they were called the Pumas from that day onwards. And so it all dates back to Central Africa. But yeah, there we go.
Peter, you probably got it structured, but I just want to just take the listeners back now. I want you to tell us about the copper story. Where did that start? And because that's just such an important thread running through the time that we've covered.
Yeah. Well, the reason that the settlers here did not own much land is because they weren't allowed to. They were only allowed to own it along the line of rail, because people had found out there were copper deposits up to the north. And we had a guy who spoke to us the other day about this. And there's the various seams around a mine. I think it was the Roan Antelope area, and also the place called Broken Hill. And I think it was the Broken Hill was the one that really came to its fore with the copper there. I forget an awful lot of the detail there, but that was the drive to get to the north. And of course, that is what created all the wealth for the Federation. And in fact, if you look at the population of Northern Rhodesia before World War I was less than 1,500. Before World War II, it was 30,000. And the biggest town in the country was Kitwe, which is all up in the area with Mufulira, Kitwe, Indola, and places like that. So that was the driving focus for people to get up there. And in fact, when they moved the capital from Livingston to Lusaka in 1935, many people just went straight through up to the Copperbelt to get set up with all their companies. They could see what was happening. And by the end, when our just before independence, our population was 70,000 Europeans. They were mainly in the north, around that Gulf Belt. Not many down here. So it was very much the driving force of the economy and the country and the drive and everything else that was there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're around 1960. Kariba Dam is now commissioned by the Queen, and we still
Queen Mother.
Okay, and we're still part of the Federation of the Rhodesians.
Well, the Federation came to an end really at the end of '63, because you had the two protectorates to the north and the colony to the south, and the nationalists, especially in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, did not want to be a further part of the Federation. They saw it as an unequal partnership. Botswana had been invited into it at the very beginning, but turned it down. Nyasaland was really, as far as I'm aware, was coerced into it, and really arguably should have played no part in it. But it was felt that the focus was too much to the south, and the economics of the whole game, they felt it was being drawn into the south. As far as I understand it, I'm not the expert on this, and I'm happy to be pulled apart on my facts. But of course, being protectorates, they had a greater ability to say, enough, thank you, we now want to go forward, because that's what's written in the contract. It was to prepare the countries for when they could actually run it themselves. And many people thought that this was not happening. And there were many debates going on in the Houses of Parliament in the UK, where parliamentarians in the UK were supporting the nationalists, saying, well, hang on, you must now allow them their time for independence. That's what we promised. That's what we need to deliver. And so it was given to them. And the Federation came to I would say a slightly premature end, possibly, because more development would have left the countries in a better state to go forward. But nonetheless, it was all achieved. And fortunately in Zambia, it was very, very peaceful. And we went about our business.
Right. And then independence in 1964. And
yes, and our name comes from the Zambezi River. And since the Zambezi starts in northern Zambia and spends most of its journey either inside our borders or as a border between Zimbabwe and Zambia, I think it's quite appropriate that we should have taken possession of its name. But unfortunately, well, the first few years were very successful. Many people stayed behind, including my parents, and things were working well. But unfortunately, it's when the Bush War on your side of the river then came into play, and of course you can't put trainloads of copper effectively and efficiently through a war zone, and our economy slowly started to fall apart. Now Zambia was like one could understand it, was embracing another side to politics, and they were following the socialist and communist idea. And you had many visitations by people from Russia, China, Cuba, and others coming through. But of course, the economy started to decline, and things slowly started to fall apart. And many people left in the late 70s, going into the 80s. But we always had our bits of humor in there. We had a very hopeful citizen here called Edward Makuka Nkoloso, who was the founder of something that was called the Zambian National Academy of Science, Space Research and Philosophy, and he was challenging NASA to get to the moon. And in fact, he thought that he could even get to Mars. So it was a man well ahead of his time.
Peter,
yes, yeah.
I just want to ask you. Let's just go back a bit again. I want you to tell us about the Barotse central government conflict. At independence, am I not right in saying the Lozi people actually wanted some form of autonomy? They were not happy to go into a unitary state under UNIP, and they did want. There was talk of secession. There was a treaty that I think was put together by the British to placate them. And if I'm correct, the terms of that treaty were not strictly adhered to by the new government, which has caused quite a lot of unhappiness with.
It's caused a lot of angst. It certainly has, and it was caused the Barotseland Agreement. But again, you go back into history when it was Northwestern and Northeastern Rhodesia. When it was formed as Northern Rhodesia, it was two protectorates. So it was a protectorate within a protectorate. And I haven't read too much into it, but there were even suggestions that possibly Barotseland was going to move with the South, as opposed to staying within one country. And again, if you go back to those early years, the outside influence of Northeastern Rhodesia was in fact Nyasaland. A lot of the administrative styles and paperwork came from Nyasaland, whereas from Northwestern Rhodesia, it came from the South.
Yeah.
You know, it was a big link up. For example, we've just been doing some historical talks here, and the main crossing point from Southern Rhodesia into Northwestern Rhodesia was not here at Victoria Falls. It was down by Binga, because the capital of the zone was Colombo. And if you take a straight line from Bulawayo to Colombo, it crosses at Walker's Drift, which is now the upper reaches of Lake Kariba. Yeah. So heavy influences in there.
You know, Peter, the bit of time I spent in Barotseland in Western Zambia, and I did get to know some of the senior Indunas and in fact the Lutunga. And I got the very strong impression that they had a very strong affection, if I could put it that way, for the British and what they set out to achieve. I detected absolutely no bitterness. In fact, a sense that they had felt more comfortable under British rule than they were under what came subsequently. There was a very easy rapport, and I got the impression there was no anti-colonial or anti-white sentiment amongst the Lozi leadership.
Yeah, and I think that can be said through across the whole of Zambia today. There's always been good relationships, but especially with that family. You know, the Lutunga sent his sons to Bethany School in the United Kingdom, and there's a little monument at the school to this day that remembers that. There was obviously a lot of traffic when the Lutunga went to the coronation, for example, in 1902. They trafficked through Southern Rhodesia to get down to the bottom. When you go to Bulawayo Cemetery, two of the Lozi princes are buried there. I understand it that when a new Lutunga is installed, Her Majesty sends out a new uniform to the next guy. So there's been this continuing relationship of good connections between those two families and between the areas in general. And Zambia has always been, as far as I understand it, very high on Her Majesty's list of countries that she has a close affinity with. It continues to this day. And it all goes back to the way the protectorate was set up to assist. The independence was done without a bitter fight. There was certainly, as I said, a political upheaval and a bit of argument. And Her Majesty's maintained a good relationship even with President Kaunda. And why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't they both? Sorry. But certainly the extra relationship between Barotseland and the United Kingdom is there because of the royal families and all the rest. And don't forget, sadly, when Zambia became independent, UNIP, the party, got rid of the name Barotseland and shrunk their sphere of influence into an area called Western Province, which is tiny compared to what Barotseland used to be. So yes, if you had to change, if you had to move out of your house into a shed, I suspect you'd probably get a bit grumpy about it, or moved into one room of your house. And I would imagine that's how they felt, you know, very upset by the fact that what had been a very big area twice the size of England, was shrunk down to something that was very, very small. So there's bound to be some bitterness in there.
Peter, while
yeah.
we're in Barotseland, I want you to go back to where you started, talking about the Jewish influence in Northern Rhodesia, and I know there's some wonderful stories about the Jewish contribution to the development of the country and the Suzman family and related. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, there were two families in particular that came out. There was Gershevich and Suzmanovich, and obviously they got rid of the Itches and became Suzman and Gersh. The Gershes moved to the north into the Copperbelt area, and the Suzmans hung around here. There were three brothers. There was Eli, Harry, and Oscar. Oscar died quite early in the proceedings, but the other two brothers spent a lot of time in Barotseland. And in fact, if you read through the history up there, there were three advisors, if you will, to the Letunga. There was a Frenchman called Francois Colliard. There was an Englishman called George Westbeach. And then there were the two Jewish brothers. And he took advice from them. Now, Suzmanovich is actually a horse trader. Well, there aren't any horses here to trade. So they traded cattle. And of course, that's dear to any African, is your cattle. So they traded for quite a few years, the 1890s through to the early 1900s in Barotseland, and became very close to the Letunga. And when they started Livingston in 1905, the guys felt, I guess, that they had done enough walking around the bush. They moved into the town. And what's interesting is that the anti-Semitism that existed from where they'd come in Lithuania was a little bit in South Africa. Remember, prior to World War II, there were the grey shirts in South Africa that stopped them from getting off the boat as World War II was about to start up. So there was that feeling down there. But up here in Northern Rhodesia, you didn't have the anti-feeling. And when they started the town, the synagogue was supposed to be built within a block of the center of town, which
in Livingston
they wouldn't have accepted that. But they very soon, because they are the traders, they started to secure all the main trades in the area. And it was the same year, 1905, that somebody tried to kill the Tsar in Russia. And who did the secret police pick on? The Jewish people. So the first group of refugees came through from Lithuania in 1905 and swelled the numbers up. Clearly, there were more in South Africa, more in Southern Rhodesia, because that's the triangle. They're going to land in Cape Town, and some people just changed their names, others settled. But it was the hardy folk who moved up here. That was the first lot, and if you go to the Jewish Museum here in town and see what occupations they got into, none of them competed against the other. There was one in this, one in that, and so it carried on down the line. And then after World War I, obviously, there was, when the Soviets got into power, who did they pick on? Jewish people. So the second group of persecuted refugees came through from Lithuania again, and many came through looking for their relatives, who were now doing rather well in this place called Northern Rhodesia. And strange enough, in the early 1920s, we then had another group of people coming through, only this time from the state of Gujarat in India, and they call themselves the Gujus. And if you speak to any Indian, you say, who are the traders of India? They say it's people from Gujarat. And they came through and started their influence. So you now had two groups of real traders in Livingston, the Jewish people on the main street and the Indians on the next street down. And it started to hustle and bustle. And then you had Eli Suzman left Livingston in the 1930s to go down to Johannesburg, where he set up the northern branch of a company called Woolworths. Now, Woolworths did exist already. I think it was Max Sonnenberg down in Cape Town, but it wasn't very successful. And so Eli got this whole business going properly up in the north. And then his son, David, married into Marks and Spencer's of London, which is why Woolworths is closely aligned with M&S in the UK. In fact, they joined under one title. It was called Wool True, I think. But Harry remained in Livingston, and he got into business with a guy called Harry Wolfson. And they became very powerful out here. And in fact, they were the only Europeans allowed to trade in the King's area, which is Barotseland, more than half the country. There were 150 shops in there doing very good trade. And there was another particular individual whose name was Kapelovitz, Elias, and he came from Lithuania. And he built himself, perhaps not such a big empire, but very influential. He brought a wife from Latvia at the end of World War I, and they ran a completely kosher household in town, which must have been incredibly difficult in its day. But such was his influence in the area that when they died after World War II, Buckingham Palace sent a letter of condolence to the daughters. So that shows the kind of influence they had here.
Yeah, and I don't think many people know that the Woolworth story really starts in Barotseland with.
Well, I'd say the growth of it, the bigger growth of Barotseland, of Woolworths came from here, yeah, because it certainly had been started beforehand. And then, of course, we got the Jewish people coming in from Germany, Hungary, and Poland during World War II. And the last ship that was allowed to leave Germany with Jews on board was the Usambra. And it docked finally in Durban, and the grey shirts wouldn't let them off. And they said, well, we're not going back to Germany. What's the solution? They said, get on a train and go to Northern Rhodesia. So they arrived by train with very little. One chap called Joe Permanovsky used to look after them for a few days to get them sorted out, and said, right, just get north. Go north and find it, what you're looking for. And amongst them was a very, very beautiful lady who went on to go and marry Harry Wolfson. But the point here is that the numbers in Northern Rhodesia before World War II, as I think I said, was 30,000 people. By the end of the war, it was 45,000. So that extra 15,000 of the people who stayed on longer were, I should say, a lot of them were Jewish people. Now, in fact, the refugee status was much more than that, because we took a lot of people from Hungary and Poland, and there were certainly 3 Polish refugee camps up and down the country. There was one in Livingston, there was up somewhere through to Lusaka, but the camp was at Bwana Mkubwa outside Ndola. And then there was another one up at Abercorn, now called Mbala. And if you go to Mbala today, when we were up there dealing with the end of World War I celebrations in 2018, there's an area in Mbala still today called Little Poland. Now, not all of them were Jews, of course not, but many were. And this place was always seen as a place for refugees, a sanctuary, and all the rest of it. And it's added on, because when you look at Zambia's history, since independence, we've taken a lot of refugees from South Africa, Zimbabwe, the Congo, Somalia, and all the rest of it. So that's why I'm interested so much with the history before independence, because actually it's a mirror. And you see so many good things that are happening today did actually happen beforehand, which many people have forgotten about. And Zambia's role in the United Nations and all that they do there with peacekeeping, it's very high on the list of people's appreciation around the world for what the Zambians get up to, and it's immense pride that this country has and what its people does. But I would suggest that it's sort of been there for quite a long time, looking after other people.
Peter, a name that's familiar to millions of people around the world is Wilbur Smith. Just tell us a little bit about the Wilbur Smith story and the Northern Rhodesian connection.
Okay, well, I put it out the other day that Wilbur was born in Kabwe, Broken Hill, and somebody came back and said, no, he wasn't. He was born in Ndola. I just remember his books said he was born in Northern Rhodesia. Now, when I spoke to Jack Crutchley before he died, he intimated that he had been born in Broken Hill with Wilbur, although Wilbur was slightly older than him. Whatever it is, he was born here, and they did live in Broken Hill. But his parents eventually moved down to Mazabuka, and they owned a farm that is now part of the very big Zambia sugar estate. And his earlier stories are all based on stories that he would have heard from his father, and some of his characters are around his relatives. I know there was a relative called Courtney somewhere along the line who was in South Africa. Not suggesting that he was involved in the battle at Rorke's Drift or anything else, because as one of his books made out, but it is just a story at the end of the day. But when you read the books, he does talk about in one of them the problems at the time of independence when there were the panga gangs, the cha-cha-cha that was going on, and that comes into one of the stories. I can't remember which one it was, but he always refers back to his Northern Rhodesian days, as any person would when it's full of freedom, and we still have that today here in this country. As a youngster, my daughter is doing exactly what I did: barefoot, fancy free, running around, picking up chongololos. The people are so incredibly friendly in Zambia, as they always have been, as they are in Zimbabwe. It's just in the politics of it all. We have a very good relationship with the people who we're very, very privileged to live amongst. And Wilbur Smith goes back to it all the time: the freedom of Africa, the smell of the earth, especially when it rains. Nobody in the world, I think, has a life like the rest of us growing up in a place like this.
Peter, so he went to school in Northern Rhodesia.
For a period of time, he was in Kabwe, yes, and then he moved down to, is it Cornwallis, down in Pretoria, and then I think he went on to Hilton or Michael House after that. But he kept his connection with Zambia.
Yeah, he did. I think When the Lion Feeds was actually based to quite a large extent on the story of Major Pretorius, the jungle man, who also spent quite a bit of time in Northern Rhodesia, in fact, in the Chiawa area.
Yes.
And he was hunting elephant there and up to all sorts of things. And then I think it was actually the British administration there. And if I remember correctly, it was a district commissioner by the name of Tabra who started to get in Pretorius's face, because Pretorius was probably not playing by the rules. And that's when he went up to Tanganyika, and he started messing around there. And it was when he then, I think, he got into trouble with the Germans, with the German authorities. And that's why when the Brits were trying to get a grip of Valletta Voorbeck, they turned to Major Pretorius to help them. And he's the guy who actually found the Koenigsberg in the refugee.
Correct.
And organized.
Which comes into Wilbur Smith's book, Shout at the Devil.
And it was Shout at the Devil. That's right. Yeah, I think that's loosely based around Major Pretorius' story.
Now, I think he also got involved in helping to cut the way through the Belgian jungles to get the Mimi and Tutu going as well, and he had a fallout with the British naval commander Geoffrey Spicer Simpson, but he was something of an eccentric, and I suspect he didn't go down well with everybody, and there was probably a split somewhere along the line. But yeah, I mean, I remember reading that book, Shout at the Devil, and then tracing some of the stories, the reality of it all, of what Pretorius got up to. A fascinating guy. Yeah, for sure.
Peter, we're running out of time, but before we finish, I just want to go back to the First World War and a little bit more about the Rhodesians in Tanganyika, in the effort against Valletta Voorbeck. I mean, it's an amazing military campaign. As you mentioned briefly earlier, a very small German contingent, really, that caused enormous problems for the Allied forces. And the one battalion that seems to have been able to get the job done was Northern Rhodesians. And that was a combination of North and Southern Rhodesian soldiers who, and then of course, that's where Courtney Selous ended his days. Just a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously you had the two German territories, and there was what von Vorbeck wanted to do at one point was to see if he could join up with the guys in Namibia, but Namibia gave up pretty quickly, and that's where 1st Battalion Rhodesia Regiment went down with a young man called Harris, who became Bomber Harris, as you know. So that put the plans for a bigger fighting force to rest. And so von Lettow-Vorbeck, what he wanted to do was to keep enough British troops tied up so they couldn't go to the Western Front. Yeah. As you know, he attacked 3 British territories, which no other German commander ever did. And he first struck into Kenya, and that's where the Rhodesia Regiment, 2nd Rhodesia Regiment, spent a lot of time. But sadly, so many died of diseases more than fighting. But if you go to Kenya today, there still is Rhodesia Hill by the Tsavo National Park. But von Vorbeck knew what he was doing, and he did hit and runs. He knew he was never going to win a proper battle. I think at Tabora, he tried to take the British head on as a proper standing army, and then realized very quickly he wasn't going to have much success. So his better way was to hit and run. And they chased him, all, as you know, all the way down through Tanganyika, all the way into Mozambique, where the Portuguese got upset. So he gained more time out of this to turn around and start legging it all the way back up. So it's purely delay tactics. But the people who were really involved at the end was actually the Northern Rhodesia police. They'd become a paramilitary fighting force. Mm-hmm. And what had been the Northern Rhodesia Rifles was disbanded in 1916. And all those people involved with that unit were then sent to other regiments, some to Europe and some to stay with the Rhodesia Regiment and things like that. But it was actually the police that took on the brunt of everything down here. And it was they who fired the last shot on the 13th of November at Chambeshi, when von Lettow was trying to attack a rubber factory. Yeah, and they were hardy men. Those well, they all were. Anybody who comes out here is going to be like the pioneer, like it is in the United States and Canada. They're the frontiersmen. They were hard people. They didn't take to taking orders from people who didn't know much about what was going on.
Peter, we're going to end it there for now, and I really hope we can carry on with another talk, because there's so much history here that I really don't think a lot of people know about, and it's so interesting. But I just wish the younger generation would listen to what you're telling us, because it's only through history and knowing about what happened that you realize how tough it was to build these countries and to put in place what is there. And unfortunately, the younger generation, and I think it's because they don't know enough history, they don't realize how hard it was to build these countries, and that's why they find it so easy to tear them down. You know, I
couldn't agree more. But in what I found interesting here, and we haven't even gone through the Zambian history here, but there are parallels. Like, we should never have beaten the All Blacks. Zambia should never have won the Africa Cup of Nations, and you can use these parallels all the way through it. Okay, but what for me is that when I tell the stories, it's the young Zambians who want to know more. They come to me and say, right, please tell us more detail, give more detail on X, Y, and Z. And I've had the Education Ministry of Zambia come to me and say, please put this down in writing so we can start to get it into the schools.
Wonderful.
So there is a thirst by certainly the youngsters in Zambia to get to know it. They want to know things, and it's just a question of making them excited about their own history. Like the one, as we know, the big sport in Africa for the world is soccer. Nobody ever tells you that the greatest footballer in history, goal scoring in a season, is a Zambian who scored 107 goals in it. And the Zambians said, well, why not? We know it. I said, but you haven't told it enough to people. You need to get out there and say that it is not Cristiano Ronaldo. It's a young Zambian who did it. We know it. The rest of the world doesn't. And that's the same thing. Well, why weren't we told about the history before independence, or what we did? You know, that the fact that the Angoni chiefs raised 36 pounds and a shilling to help the British buy an airplane in World War One. And you go, oh, we did that? Yes. And we did other things. And it's always been a good relationship. But as I said in the very beginning, newspapers want to sell the bad news about Africa.
Yeah.
They promote the famine, the disasters, the coup d'etats, all the rest of it, instead of focusing on the happier stories of things that are good reading and that we should be trying to follow. The success stories, the success of the Botswanan economy, the success of Zambia, all getting on with each other, and things like that.
I agree. There are some good stories. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bad stories coming out of Africa,
sure.
And we can't change that. But it is great to hear about the positive side. And it's also good to hear what you say about the young Zambians wanting to know the history. Because unfortunately, I think that's what's going wrong with a lot of the modern Western world. History is paid less and less attention to. And that's why I think you've got things like this cancel culture, and you've got an incredibly entitled approach to life with the younger generation, just assuming that everything just happens. And in their own countries, I mean, it's not only Africa, it's in Europe, it's in America. Very few of the new generation know enough about how their countries came to be successful. They're very critical now. They can see no right, but if they had a better understanding of the journey traveled by their forebears, they might be a little more appreciative and a little better behaved. But we're going into the modern day.
Sure.
And that's not where I want to be. So I'm just going to thank you again for a fascinating talk, and I look forward to carrying on with us.
No problem at all, Hannes. We'll chat to you soon.
Thanks, Peter.